next thing we want to consider is sort of the standard arguments you'll get trying to validate the canon, how we got the books that go in the canon. They appeal to historical evidence. They try to appeal to how close they were to the time of the apostles, whether the apostles wrote the books, the documents, or someone who wrote them are closely associated with the apostles. And that's perfectly rational. That's what you would expect. That's the kind of evidence that you would expect, considering the question of the canon. That the great salvation, Hebrews says, it was first spoken by the Lord, was confirmed unto us by them that heard him. And so you would expect that. But when you put these things into the hands of skeptics, they immediately attack the authorship of the various books of the Bible. They're going to attack the book of the Hebrews doesn't mention an author directly, and so they're going to say that it undermines the validness of the validity rather of those particular books, whether they belong in the canon or not. So there's always going to be these counter arguments with skeptics, and there is no absolute rule that we can say, this book should be in there, this book shouldn't, because every rule that we come up with that historically has been, when you say, well, there's coherence, there's uniformity, harmony in the scriptures, and this points to the testimony that God is within those pages of that particular book. But there's also the fact that Paul references books that to the Corinthians. He wrote in Philippians 3:1 that he had, there may be another epistle that he alluded to, Colossians 4 about the letter or epistle to the Laodiceans, and so there's other references to scriptures that Paul wrote, and he probably wrote many more than that, and there's probably the other apostles wrote things. So the mere fact of apostleship is not enough. It's not the final rule, and there's no way to validate it historically. And the other problem you have with that is, if you were to appeal to history only deals in probabilities. And your probability, as we discussed in one of the other videos on probability, is that depending upon where you start, if you start with naturalism, then what you decide is probably a lot more likely than something else is going to be directly determined by what you presuppose the world to be. If everything is just naturalistic events and God does not exist, or or he's deistic, or he has no involvement in history, well, your probabilities are going to be completely different. If somebody says, hey, Jesus rose from the dead, and even if they granted that, even they said, okay, it looks like that's a very likely explanation for the empty tomb, but for you, they could just simply say, for you to interpret it based on the biblical analysis and say that this proves he's the Son of God with power and all these other explanations, that is not directly connected. You're interpreting the resurrection. It may just simply be that Jesus rose from the dead and something strange happened in history. That's what they could appeal to. They could just say simply that Ripley's Believe It or Not, an unlikely event occurred. And then there was this mythology that built up around the resurrection years following, because you'll hear skeptics argue that the deity of Christ came later. It's a later development or innovation that came later. And so they interpret it that way. So the point is, skeptics are always going to be, they're always going to be given ground to operate if you don't start with presuppositionalism. And so the other problem that we want to recognize is that if you do subject all these facts to historical analysis, the best you can come up with is some degree of probability. And I don't even know how you necessarily determine that. How likely is it that this book belongs in the canon and this one doesn't? But if you say that this is probably, Paul wrote, he probably wrote this epistle. If you end, your analysis with probabilities, how can you derive infallibility from probability? You can't do it. You can't say that this is probably the Word of God, and so therefore, infallibly, you need to submit to it. You have to start with the Word of God as the impossibility of the contrary. From the presuppositional argument is you start with the fact that the Bible provides you with the preconditions of all knowledge. Without the Bible, there is no knowledge. God is so transcendent that you can't even think unless He exists. You can't trust your thoughts. Thought is not even possible. And if the fact that you can think, so the fact that you do think coherently is evidence that that God does indeed exist. So again, probability cannot bring us infallibility, and probabilities are determined by your worldview, and naturalistic historians are always going to have some other explanation that they say is more likely, more probable than what you Christians are claiming about the Bible. So let's not fall into that trap, and presuppositionalism will allow us to escape those dead ends. Okay.